获得多个学位荣誉。Dr. New 博士在结合其近20年的医学实践经验，测试了超过6000种膳食补充品，在其整个职业生涯中创建了163种膳食补充剂配方。Dr. New 博士同时也是具有40多年经验的专业演说家，乐于分享交流，向全球26个国家的保健人员提供教育与培训支持。那么今天我们很荣幸请到Dr. New 博士来到现场，为我们做糖制科技的解析和讲解。让我们掌声有请Dr. New 博士。
Thank you, folks. Thank you. Oh, it's so good to be here. This is my first time ever in my entire life to be in Macau. I've been to Hong Kong many times, but never to Macau. So this is cool, good experience. Of course, I'm only here for a few hours. I flew in last night, I fly out Monday morning, so, oh well, but good experience. Thank you for all coming here today. Very good-sized crowd. Very pleased about that. We are going to start in my presentation, and of course, following my presentation, we have Dr. Sun, who will be talking, she is Chinese, she'll be talking to you in Chinese, that'll be easier for you. And she'll be doing more product details for you. My presentation starts with history of the science, and then I'm going to talk about the science of a couple of our important products specifically, and then I'm going to give you a preview of 3 new products coming to Greater China in August that I know will excite all of you. I'm sure it will. So, and when I do this with translators, even with the very best translators in the world, and by the way, we have 2 superb translators here who will do a fabulous job for you. And I'm confident that whatever I say, they'll know how to say it to you. But I don't do as many jokes with translators because there's always a 3 to 5 second delay, and sometimes that makes it tough for jokes. So sorry about that, because I like to do jokes in my presentations, but oh well. All right, let's start with the history of the science. Why is this important? As you talk to people about glycans, which is this correct scientific term, or what we know as glyconutrients, that's the commercial term. And of course the product is ambrotose, and Mannatech, those 2 products. But as you talk to new people about this, they will very often say to you, I've never heard of that. Is there any science? I've even talked to doctors, and I've been teaching doctors for years. I have a number of degrees in a number of disciplines. And of course, I practice integrative medicine for just over 20 years in the United States. I have created courses that help doctors to renew their licenses. In many countries, a doctor has to renew their license to practice every year. And in the United States, a doctor has to attend a certain number of courses that are called continuing medical education. And if he or she passes those courses, then they can get their licenses for practice renewed. So I've written a number of those, and I've been teaching doctors now for more than 30 years. And what I'm surprised about always is that the doctors will say to me at first, I've never heard of this stuff before. Is there any science? So that's why Tim Chang, your country manager, has asked me to start today with the history of the science. I want you to see just how strong it really is. It's going to amaze some of you. I know, because every time I teach doctors, it always amazes them about how much there is. I've clinically tested more than 6,000 dietary supplements. And these are clinical tests that I've done with human volunteers. I'm able to do this because when I was in practice, I made so much money in my practice. It was a huge practice. I had many doctors working for me on my staff. It was a very big facility. And I was able to teach doctors, but importantly, I was able to help people who had no money, who were poor, but they needed health care. And so I was able to take care of them, and I took care of all of their needs. I paid for everything myself. I believe that it is important for doctors to serve human health. And that's the way I envision my job and my career. And that's why I did that. Well, as a favor, I would often ask these patients, would you allow me to give you this new dietary supplement and then do blood tests or whatever the necessary tests were to determine if the product actually makes any changes in your body? So this allowed me to test more than 6,000 different products. So I know a lot about how these products work in human beings. I know a lot about the products in our industry, and probably more than any doctor that you will meet, I think, in our industry. So with this in mind, I think I must have gone backwards here on the slides. So I've been lecturing for more than 40 years, and that's because I started when I was 10 years old. That was a joke, but a little delayed there. No, actually I didn't start when I was 10 years old, but I've been lecturing for a long time. And this is, why are my slides moving when I'm not moving them? Is there a reason for this? Okay, I need to control the slides, if that's okay with you folks. I don't know why, but these things have been moving and I haven't been touching it. Okay. So maybe we've got some kind of radio transmitter in the room that's doing this, I don't know. It's freaking me out as I'm talking and they're changing, and that's not what I'm talking about. Okay, so in the science of what's known as glycobiology, with glycans, we've learned a great deal scientifically. We know that there are more than 200 different plant glycans, or glyconutrients, that are found in plants. Now most people, when you say glyconutrient, they'll say, well, what is that? You say, well, it's a plant saccharide. What does that mean? Well, saccharide means sugar. But as soon as you say sugar to somebody, the only sugar the average person knows is table sugar. So they think, oh, table sugar, that's harmful. And that makes you fat, and that's really bad. Okay, there are more than 200 sugars known in plants. There's only a couple of them that taste good. If you were to simply taste the glycans in ambrotose, you know they don't taste good. I mean, you know immediately. You know immediately they're not table sugar. Table sugar are what are called disaccharide sugars. We don't use disaccharide sugars at Mannatech at all, because they're not good for you and they have no potential value. So we simply don't use them. We're only using those plant sugars that we know to be safe and beneficial. And you'll learn more about that as we proceed. So as you look at the potentials for this, one of the questions obviously that comes up is, could my blood sugar go up if I use one of these plant saccharides? We've done a human double-blind placebo-controlled test where we tested blood sugar at baseline early in the morning. Then we gave the volunteers, the human volunteers, we gave them ambrotose at 4 grams, which is our normal recommendation. And then we tested their blood sugar again. Not one person, not one single person in that study had a change in blood sugar at all. No change in blood sugar, why? Because we don't use disaccharide sugars. So feel safe. With Mannatech, we have 3 words that are important. The first word is science. The second word is safety. And the third word is efficacy. So Mannatech uses the latest science to create the safest and most effective products. That's what Mannatech is all about. Okay? So let's do a little bit of history here. There have been written records of glycans, or glyconutrients, in history that literally go back to 340 BC. when Alexander the Great, recognizing the physicians in his army, knew that aloe had some kind of extraordinary property for wound healing. So he actually had entire shiploads of aloe plants shipped to the Middle East for his beginning of his campaign. And then he had entire wagon trains full of aloe plants with men whose only job was to keep those aloe plants healthy. And when his men were wounded in battle, the physicians would break off a bit of the aloe plant and apply it to the wounds right away, because it's been known for all this time that for some reason there was something in aloe vera that made wounds heal faster and more efficiently. Well, when we get to 1983, because I've done this chronologically, I'm a scientist, I like to do things in a linear fashion. Okay. So when we get to 1983, you'll see what happens there. But as we go through history, back in 1857 was the first study where one scientist said, how does this stuff work when you swallow it? That was the first study. Your doctor almost certainly does not know that. And of course, the studies then continue with what's the structure? And you'll note later in my presentation that I will say more than once, structure affects function. The structure is actually key to the function when you're talking in pure scientific terms. But the biggest research, although there was a little research here and there throughout the 1800s, but the biggest research started in the 20th century. It was then that scientists began to study things in humans and animals that were related to glycans or glyconutrients. One of the things that they studied back in 1922 eventually became a drug that would save hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of lives. And what they did was they were studying laboratory animals, and they noticed that there was a mechanism in human blood that affected the way blood either got thinner or thicker. Now, of course, the potential there is tremendous if you understand that mechanism. And that's normal. The human body is designed to provide you with everything you need. But we don't live in that same environment that the human body was initially designed in. Things have changed. Our diet has changed. Pollution has changed. Stress has changed. There's so many things on planet Earth now that are different than they were throughout the majority of human history. And this is why it's important to use science to find the answers that we need that are safe and effective for human health. So we'll remember that heparin was first studied in 1922, but as we progress, we'll see when it becomes a drug. So the first study that was published in PubMed, which is the biggest scientific library in the United States, but not the only scientific library. There are 7 scientific libraries in the world that each have millions of scientific studies in various topics. And then there's a long list of other scientific libraries in different countries that have fewer studies, but there's lots of these. So I want you to know that PubMed is not the only one. PubMed right now has about 13 million studies total, and that total grows literally every day. That's how science is moving forward. Well, the first study was published in 1950, and that was important for glycobiology, a term that didn't exist yet in 1950, by the way. And in 1953, when there had been a major concern about what happens if atomic weapons got used on planet Earth. What would happen with people having radiation sickness and so on? So these scientists in 1953 did a study using aloe vera, fresh aloe vera, on laboratory rabbits that were deliberately irradiated with the same kind of radiation you'd get from an atomic blast. And these rabbits were in pretty bad shape. And when they applied the fresh aloe gel to the radiation burns on the rabbits that received the aloe gel healed. The other rabbits obviously didn't. That was another important step. Again, we saw these healing properties with aloe, but no one actually understood the science. We didn't know the mechanism. We just knew there was something in aloe that was doing it. We hadn't discovered what it was yet. Well, science progresses, and now by 1960 you go from one study to 213. In science, that's actually a pretty big leap, because science moves very slowly. Science moves systematically, one step at a time. Sometimes you do the same study 2 and 3 times just to make sure you're correct. That's the way science moves. Well, a group of scientists in 1971, they said, let's take a chance and let's take this aloe stuff. Let's put it into an injectable, something we can put into an IV, an intravenous drip. And let's see if it can have an effect on laboratory animals that have tumors. What they saw was astounding. Now again, no one understood why it worked. No one knew. And in fact, they kept studying proteins because everyone thought that proteins would be the key, and everyone was wrong. And sometimes that happens in science. Well, it was then in 1974, so 52 years after the first animal studies on heparin were done, that they approved it as a drug. And now that drug, which is called heparin sodium, has saved who knows how many lives. So when people have the threat of blood clots, which can threaten you for stroke or heart attack, what they did was they gave them this heparin sodium that they still use today in every hospital in the world, and it works. And that drug was made as a result of studying the normal natural mechanism of a glucosamine inside of humans and animals that exists in us normally. Pretty astounding stuff. I love science. I could talk about science without stop for days at a time. I just love science so much. So it's a good thing that I'm the senior scientist and not the marketing director, right? Anyway, so by 1990, you now have more than 4,000 studies. The science is moving forward just on PubMed alone. And now they've isolated, finally, in 1983, a scientist who was to become Mannatech's first chief of science. He discovers, and almost by accident, by the way, which sometimes science works that way. You know, we're going down a particular pathway and we find out that, well, that was not the right pathway. And then almost by accident, he discovers it's not a protein. That's why nobody could find the solution. He found out it was a carbohydrate. He found out it was a plant saccharide, a plant sugar. Now, not a sweet sugar, not a sugar that raises your blood sugar, but this was a plant saccharide, a specific one in the aloe vera plant. So he isolates it. And what he understands quickly is that when that's exposed to oxygen, it degrades almost immediately. Within 3 days, that functional component in the aloe vera gel becomes completely useless. So his challenge then was, let's find out why it becomes useless, and now let's find out a way to stabilize it so it can be used for years after you've taken it out of the aloe vera plant. This process of discovery to stabilize the functional component in aloe vera created what is now trademarked as Mannapol. Mannapol is scientifically known as ace-mannan. Now, ace-mannan has particular qualifications, and I'm going to give you a comparison in a few minutes because there are lots of companies now that look at Mannatech's more than $50 million US of research, and these other companies have done $0 US of research. But they want to use our research. So they want to say, oh, we're just like Mannatech. We're the same as Mannapol. We're the same as Ambertosis. they're not. And I'm going to show you in a few minutes that they are definitely not the same. So this discovery now, going back to the radiation study on rabbits, and knowing that this has immune properties for healing, but still not fully understanding all of the properties back in 1983. In 1984, the pharmaceutical company that our first chief of science worked for, because Mannatech did not exist at that time, this scientist says, well, let's make this into a burn gel or a wound gel. And they did, and it was called kerosene. And it became the single most popular wound gel for hospitals in the United States. Virtually every hospital in the United States carried this wound gel. It was their number one wound gel, especially for burns and burn centers, for decades. So, again, none of the scientists, including the man who made the initial discovery, still really understood yet what we're working with. We've learned a lot since then, a great deal. In fact, we've now learned the pathway for these glycans. And for those of you who are not scientists, which will be most of you, one of the questions that comes up from the scientists is like, well, what's the pathway? What's the mechanism of action? How is it digested? How is it assimilated? And then how is it utilized by the human body? These are all separate studies that we have done. And we now understand the pathways. And in fact, a couple of years later, the Oxford Dictionary comes up with a new word, glycobiology. And this new word was to describe a combining of two sciences together. And glycobiology is now a science which is taught in universities around the world. Well then, by 1990, you're up to 12,000 studies just on PubMed. So again, if you talk to somebody about these products, and I sincerely hope that all of you understand what I've done today and what Dr. Sun has done today, the importance of these products for human health, because this is what my life is about, helping people with their health worldwide. I want everyone to understand how important it is to use the best product to support all of your health benefits every day. It's crucially important. So I want all of you to understand just the magnitude of what we have scientifically. And someone says to you, oh, well, I've never heard of that. Well, you haven't read the thousands of studies on it then, have you? And this will include, by the way, most doctors. I know this because I teach doctors all the time. As this expands, we now start in the 1990s, we have a sudden sort of explosion in glycobiology, where whole bunches of scientists are getting really interested in glycobiology now. And this was great for us. And it starts to get published in some really important journals in the world, scientific journals. Most of these journals are pretty complicated, and really only scientists in those given areas are able to fully understand what these journals are saying in every respect. Well, there was a study done on Ace Mannet. Again, that's the functional component of the aloe vera plant, which has been stabilized, extracted and stabilized in an exclusive technology that is owned by Mannatech. And I'll explain the differences in a moment. And this study was talked about as an immunostimulant study. Well, doctors are taught to think in terms of stimulating the immune system if it's weak, and suppressing the immune system if you have an autoimmune disease. So that's the way doctors look at it. That's how the drugs work. But what does your body really want? It doesn't want immunostimulation. It doesn't want immunosuppression. Because when you suppress the immune system, you open yourself up to illness. What it wants is immunomodulation. So immunomodulation means a natural mechanism in your body that raises your immune function to normal when it's weak, and brings your immune system down to normal when it needs to be brought down. The key for you always is normal. You don't want stimulation, you don't want suppression, you want normal immune function. That's what an immunomodulator does. But initially when the studies were done, scientists didn't really understand that, so they were looking at stimulating. And when they gave the first injections to cats and dogs, they found out that these cats and dogs who had serious immune challenges got healthy real fast. Then they looked at a study on chickens. Now, I don't know how much people think about this, but there's a lot of chicken consumed in the world. And there's a common virus to chickens, which only chickens get. And this particular virus was killing billions of chickens just in the United States alone. So these scientists said, what if we use some of this Ace-Mannin stuff in a vaccine? I wonder if it could help the chickens. Well, guess what? It saved the lives of billions and billions of chickens, and still is today. Simple, natural, safe. This very special thing made from Ace-Mannin. So as we look at the science, excuse me, I'm dehydrated. Long flight, you get dehydrated pretty fast. So we look at the science of what's in this Ace-Mannin stuff. It contains mannose, but it contains a number of other glycans as well. Galactose, which is what your body needs to fight inflammation. And mannose, of course, and the others that you see on the screen, these make up the product that today we call ambrotose. But that's the scientific description of each of them. By the way, xylose is the only one of that group that's actually sweet. I use xylose as my personal sweetener. That's all I use. Because I don't want to use artificial sweeteners and I don't want to use table sugar. Harper's Biochemistry came up in 1996, and the senior author, a doctor named Dr. Robert Murray, who's a very dear friend of mine. He and I are great friends for many, many years. Brilliant scientist, and so humble. I love that in a man as brilliant as he is. And he was the senior researcher and author who came out and said, we have now identified 8 glycans which are crucial to cellular communication. In fact, he said, absolutely necessary for cellular communication. Well, a lot of people in the medical community just said, what does that mean? I'll explain it to all of you in a few moments. Even in the scientific community, many scientists we don't understand why that's valuable, but you will in a few minutes. So we got our first composition of matter patent, which is a pretty difficult patent to get, by the way, back in 1996. And this composition of matter patent, it talks about how you're combining certain things in a unique fashion, things that have never been done before. By the way, Mannatech throughout its lifetime has earned 138 patents. That's pretty impressive. That's a lot of science, a lot of science. Very impressive stuff. So, you've got some pretty important stuff to look at here in terms of cellular communication, and I'll tell you how that works in a few moments. There was also some very important work done in the area called congenital defects of glycosylation, or CDGs. Scientists had always believed, prior to this, scientists had always believed in something called the glucose-only theory. And what that means in very simple terms is that if you eat anything that has sugar in it, table sugar, that your blood glucose will automatically create the 8 saccharides that you need for cellular communication. That was the theory. And by the way, that theory is still being taught in some medical schools today, even though it's been disproven and it's out of date, it's still being taught. One scientific study found out that, you know what? It doesn't work like that. But not a lot of scientists, I think, read that study, but when the CDG study came out, we found that there were at least, and there's probably more, but in science we only talk about what we confirm, okay? So there are at least 13 different diseases where people are born with a genetic defect. The genetic defect, it turns out, does not allow them to be able to take glycans from food and attach those glycans to their cell surface receptor sites for function. As a result, they're not well. So that's what the CDG study told us, and that also confirmed then the glucose-only theory obviously doesn't work, because if it did, you wouldn't have these problems. So the next step for the scientists was, is there a way to provide glycans to a human being in a way that they don't need to extract it from a food? Obviously, if they're missing the enzyme to do that, well, you'd have to give it to them in a way that doesn't require that enzyme. So that was an important step in science for us. Our first international patent came in South Africa in 1998. And then we had some more studies on how various glycans are metabolized, which are important for scientists, not so much for the average person, just to know that the study is there. As I lecture around the world to audiences that are not scientists or doctors, I always tell them, don't worry about trying to remember what all these studies did, what they said, what they meant. Just understand the studies are there and they've been done. That's what you need to concentrate on. So, a little more of the same here in Newton Graphic Science magazine on cellular messaging. But this was important in 2001. Everybody's heard of the Human Genome Project. Everybody knows about that worldwide. Some people know that there's a Human Proteome Project. That's a study of all the proteins in the human body and what they do. But very few people know that there's a Human Glycome Project. And that's to study what all the glycans or glyconutrients